Hi everyone! Today's notes are on the theory of evolution. Evolution is defined as gradual change over time. In biology, we are talking about the gradual change of species over time. So for example, here we have the evolution of the modern day horse, and particularly looking at teeth and bone structure, you can see many similarities in their ancestors. However, instead of having toes like the Eohippus, they have fused bones that form their hoof. There were a lot of early ideas around evolution that have since been disproven, and one of the major people was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. His work was published in 1809, and he had two main ideas. One was the idea of use and disuse, which was that the more the body is used, the better or stronger it becomes, whereas the parts that were used less become weaker and may go away over time. His other idea was about acquired characteristics, which is that the characteristics of an organism developed through use and disuse could be passed on to its offspring. So for example, for acquired characteristics, a bodybuilder with larger muscles, so through use, continued use, he's getting bigger, better muscles. But with acquired characteristics, it would happen that his baby would be born with large muscles. Does this actually happen? No, because we know that things like muscles are built up over time, and that's an environmental factor. It's not a genetic change. So since bodybuilding does not change your DNA, it cannot be passed on to offspring. In order to help disprove Lamarck's ideas, in 1870, Weismann cut the tails of 22 generations of mice off. So this would be an acquired characteristic because in their lifetime they are losing that body structure. He wanted to see if the offspring of these mice would have tails. And in fact, they did, because the genes are not affected by their life experiences. Now, is this totally true? No, because we know that exposure to mutagens, like UV light, chemicals, etc., can affect our DNA. They can cause mutations, which are changes in the DNA. However, we also know that most characteristics that we acquire through use or practice, such as learning to paint, learning to play a sport or an instrument, lifting weights, removing the tail of mice, they do not affect our DNA. So under Lamarck's idea, if you say lost your leg in an accident, you would probably have a child without a leg. But we know that it doesn't happen that way because your DNA is still going to code for a normal body. Charles Darwin in 1844 proposed a lot of contrary ideas to Lamarck. He took a trip around the world on the HMS Beagle, which was a ship from England. He studied geology, plants, and animals. It's often said that Darwin was a naturalist because he studied a lot of things about nature. He made a lot of observations about the plants and animals that he saw on his voyage. And he noticed that they have regional similarities. So organisms that live in a similar environment are going to have similar traits. He was also influenced by other scientists, and he published his theory of evolution in 1844 in a book called The Origin of Species. Darwin's main studies happened on the Galapagos Islands. They are located off the western coast of South America, and they are an isolated area. They are made up of all these different little islands, and he saw that on the Galapagos, there were very unique plants and animals. They were very different from the mainland, and that allowed him to conclude that the mainland species had most likely changed and adapted over time after they colonized the islands. So a lot of the organisms on the Galapagos were similar to organisms found on the mainland, which would be the rest of South America, but they had unique differences. And his main studies happened in finches. So finches are a type of bird, and he collected all of this data about the finches on the different islands and how they looked, and he made the conclusions that the beak shape was affected by the type of food that that bird consumed. So most likely, the available food sources on the island allowed certain beak shapes to be more successful so that they would survive and reproduce. So let's say those finches ended up on an island with a lot of seeds. Seeds are very hard, they have to be cracked open to get the right nutrients. And so birds that had crushing bills would be able to eat more and then thus reproduce, while others in that same environment might not survive. There are 6 key ideas to Darwin's theories of evolution: reproduction, competition, variation, adaptation, natural selection, and descent with modification. Reproduction is the idea that organisms have offspring. Most species produce far more offspring than is needed to maintain the population, and that is because only a fraction of them are going to live long enough to reproduce. So it is increasing the odds that that species will survive by having many offspring in hopes that more organisms will live to reproduce. Competition arises from limited resources such as living space and food. Animals and other organisms will compete among themselves and also with other species for the necessities of life. So this could be food, it could be water. If we're talking about within a species, it could be for mates or certain shelters, etc. Variation is that characteristics in individuals are not exactly alike. There are differences in the population among every individual, and this is good for survival because it means that if the environment was to change, at least some of those organisms might have better traits. Adaptation is any kind of inherited trait that improves an organism's chances of survival and reproduction in a given environment. This inherited trait part is super important because when organisms are put into a certain environment, it's about what traits they already have genetically. So adaptation is not, oh, the bird gets there and it's going to start acting differently, it's going to sing a different song. They are only using those traits that they already innately have. So adaptation will help them survive, but it's not something that they are developing. Like, oh, it's raining outside, so I'm going to have bigger feathers today. It either is something that they have or something that they don't. Natural selection is that individuals with adaptation survive and reproduce in greater numbers than those without such traits. In the example here, our adaptation is that some mice are gray. So whenever the birds are hunting, it's going to be harder for them to see the gray mice, and they will eat more of the white mice, which will decrease the amount of white mice in the population. And descent with modification is that over many generations, favorable adaptations gradually increase in the species and unfavorable ones disappear. And this can result in new species formation. So descent means like to inherit, and modification is to change. So over time, just like we talked about in the natural selection example, we're going to see a variation of traits. Some of those are going to be better suited to survive in the environment, and the ones that are not are going to die off. So that over time, you get very slow, gradual change in the population as those traits that help organisms survive are becoming more popular. And lastly, this is a very common image that's used to compare Darwin and Lamarck. So for Lamarck, how he would think that giraffes got their long necks is that their ancestors had short necks, but while they were always stretching or reaching, their necks were going to get longer, and they would be able to pass that trait on to their offspring, which eventually results in giraffes having really long necks. Darwin, with his ideas of natural selection, would say that giraffes had ancestors with different sized necks, which would be the variation in the population. Step 2, through natural selection, long-necked giraffes lived and short-necked giraffes died. Giraffes aren't going to be like, oh, you can't reach the leaves, here, let me feed you. They are going to focus on surviving and eating enough for themselves, which means that the ones with short necks who can't get enough food are going to die off. Then the ones with long necks that survived because they were able to reach the food are going to pass that trait on to their offspring.